A white police officer, blinded by racial prejudice, forced a black man to carry heavy coal sacks as a cruel joke, completely unaware that the man he was mocking was the state's newly appointed governor. Have you ever witnessed someone being disrespected or underestimated, only for the truth to flip the situation entirely? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The summer heat clung to Redville like an unwelcome guest, intensifying the uneasy stillness that seemed to define the town. It was the kind of place where time dragged its feet, where every face told a familiar story, and where anyone who dared to leave was spoken of in hushed, judgmental tones. To the locals, leaving Redville wasn't just leaving. It was betrayal. Ethan Daniels stepped off the bus, a figure out of place yet strikingly composed. His tailored blazer and polished shoes gleamed in stark contrast to the cracked sidewalks and weathered storefronts. Years of carving out a life far beyond Redville had left their mark on him, not in arrogance, but in the quiet confidence of a man who had faced far greater storms than the whispers of a small town. Heads turned as he walked down the main street, his steps steady, his expression unreadable. Whispers rippled through the few onlookers loitering outside the diner and hardware store. Is that Ethan Daniels? Thought he'd never come back. Why now? Their voices weren't loud enough to stop Ethan, but they reached him all the same. His stride didn't falter, though his grip on the handle of his suitcase tightened slightly. The town had always been this way, judgmental, suspicious, slow to forgive. He had left Redville with dreams too big for its narrow streets, and now he returned as an outsider. A group of young men sprawled on the curb near the gas station spotted him. Their smirks widened as he approached, their laughter sharp and pointed. "Well, look who it is," one of them drawled, leaning back on his elbows. "Ethan Daniels, back from the big city. What's the matter? Didn't make it out there. Need some sympathy?" Ethan paused briefly, his gaze steady but devoid of confrontation. "Good to see you've all stayed the same," he replied evenly, his voice calm, yet carrying an unmistakable edge. The remark silenced them for a moment, the weight of his words landing with more force than they had anticipated. As he moved on, one of the younger men muttered under his breath, "Acting all high and mighty, like he's better than us." Ethan didn't turn back. His focus remained forward, though his fingers briefly adjusted the lapel of his blazer, a subtle motion that betrayed his resilience. The town's hostility was familiar, almost expected, but it no longer carried the same sting it once had. Further down the street, the crowd thickened slightly. Familiar faces appeared, some offering stiff nods, others darting glances in his direction. An older woman outside the grocer's stared at him openly, her lips pursed in disapproval. Ethan nodded politely in return, his expression betraying nothing. "Daniels," a voice cut through the murmurs. Ethan turned to see Frank Miller, owner of the general store, arms crossed as he leaned against the doorframe. His tone was laced with condescension. "You sure picked a fine time to come back," Frank said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Town hasn't changed much, in case you were wondering. Guess you thought we'd all be waiting with open arms." Ethan stopped, his gaze meeting Frank's. The two men had known each other for years. Frank, the self-proclaimed pillar of the community, had never been shy about his disdain for those who left Redville. "Some things never change," Ethan replied, his voice measured. "But I didn't come back for the town. I came back for what matters." Frank snorted, but there was no reply. Ethan's words carried an air of finality that left no room for argument. As Ethan continued his walk, the whispers grew louder behind him, but he paid them no mind. The streets of Redville were still etched in his memory, each corner, each crack in the pavement. They told stories of a life he had left behind, of struggles and small victories, of a time when leaving seemed like the only way forward. But Ethan hadn't returned for nostalgia. His purpose was far heavier than that suitcase in his hand, and it gave weight to every step he took. At the corner, a sudden noise caught his attention. A rusted pickup truck sputtered to a halt near the curb, its engine coughing and groaning. From the driver's seat emerged Martha Callahan, her silver hair tied back in a bun, her face lined with years of hard work. "Ethan Daniels, is that really you?" she called out, her voice tinged with both surprise and relief. "Bless your heart. I could use a hand here if you've got a moment." For the first time that day, Ethan's expression softened. "Of course, Mrs. Callahan," he said, setting his suitcase down. He rolled up his sleeves and made quick work of diagnosing the engine trouble. Within minutes, the old truck roared back to life. Ethan helped her reload the crates of peaches that had spilled from the back, his movements efficient but unhurried. "You're too kind, Ethan," Martha said, her smile warm. "Not many would stop and help these days." "It's the least I can do," Ethan replied, brushing his hands clean. Take care now. As he picked up his suitcase and continued on his way, the scene had not gone unnoticed. More eyes followed him now, some curious, others scrutinizing. The whispers grew quieter but more pointed. Ethan ignored them. His purpose in Redville wasn't to seek approval. He had come back to confront something far deeper than gossip and suspicion. But Redville, true to its nature, wasn't going to make it easy for him. As Ethan moved deeper into the heart of Redville, the weight of the town's scrutiny followed him like a shadow. But his steps remained steady, his resolve unshaken. The sound of sputtering and a metallic groan pierced the air as a battered pickup truck rolled to a shaky halt on the side of the road. Ethan turned his head, spotting the unmistakable figure of Martha Callahan, her petite frame struggling as she stepped out of the vehicle. The truck looked as worn and weary as the crates of peaches teetering precariously in its bed. "Ethan Daniels!" she called out, her voice cutting through the murmurs of passers-by. Her tone held a mix of surprise and relief. "Oh, thank heavens. I could use some help here. This old thing's given up on me again." Without hesitation, Ethan set his suitcase down and crossed the street, weaving through the small cluster of onlookers who had begun to gather. His measured steps and composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaotic scene around the stalled truck. "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Callahan?" Ethan asked, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp blazer. "It just stopped, like it always does at the worst times," Martha replied, exasperated. She gestured toward the peaches. "And those can't sit out in this heat much longer." Ethan nodded, already examining the truck's hood. With a smooth motion, he propped it open and leaned in, assessing the problem. "The engine's overheated," he said after a moment, his voice calm but firm. "Looks like the radiator's acting up. Do you have any water handy?" Martha rummaged through the truck's cab and handed him a half-full jug. Ethan worked quickly, his hands steady and precise. Within minutes, the truck sputtered back to life with a low rumble. "There we go," he said, closing the hood. "Bless you, Ethan," Martha exclaimed, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "You've saved me again. I don't know what I'd do without you." But Ethan wasn't finished. Turning his attention to the crates of peaches, he said, "Let's get these loaded properly before they topple over." Martha hesitated. "Oh, I couldn't ask you to." "You didn't ask," Ethan interrupted gently, already lifting a crate. As he worked, a new voice broke through the hum of conversation. Frank Miller, the owner of the general store across the street, had emerged from his shop, his arms crossed and a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, well," Frank drawled, his tone thick with sarcasm. "Look at you, Ethan, saving the day like some kind of hero." Ethan didn't respond, focusing instead on the crate in his hands. But Frank wasn't done. "Don't think a few good deeds are enough to erase the fact you turned your back on this place," Frank continued, his voice rising to ensure the gathering crowd could hear. "You walked away, Daniels. Now you come back like you're one of us?" The air grew tense, the murmurs around them fading into silence. Martha opened her mouth to say something, but Ethan straightened and turned toward Frank before she could speak. "Helping someone in need isn't about erasing the past, Frank," Ethan said evenly, his voice carrying a calm authority. "It's something anyone can do, even you." A few onlookers stifled chuckles, but Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Frank's smirk faltered for a moment before he scoffed and turned back toward his store. Ethan returned to the truck, lifting another crate as if nothing had happened. Martha, visibly flustered, looked at him with a mix of gratitude and concern. "You didn't have to say anything to him," she said quietly. Ethan placed the last crate securely in the truck bed and brushed the dust off his hands. He said his piece. "I said mine," Ethan replied. "Nothing more to it." As Martha climbed into the driver's seat, she leaned out the window. "You're a good man, Ethan. Don't let this town convince you otherwise." Ethan gave her a small nod, his expression softening. "Drive safe, Mrs. Callahan. Those peaches are counting on you." The truck rumbled away, leaving Ethan standing alone on the sidewalk. The onlookers slowly dispersed, but the tension lingered. Frank's words had struck a chord, and Ethan knew it. This wasn't the first time someone in Redville had questioned his return, and it wouldn't be the last. But the weight of their judgment no longer held power over him. Ethan retrieved his suitcase and continued down the street, his calm resolve unshaken even as the eyes of the town followed his every move. Behind the quiet stares and whispered words, the tension in Redville was beginning to build. The clinking sound of shovels hitting coal broke the heavy silence at the yard. Men in stained shirts and heavy boots moved with practiced efficiency, sweat glistening under the relentless sun. Ethan walked past, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, his head held high. His presence was an anomaly here, and the workers couldn't help but pause and glance at him. Then came the voice, sharp and loaded with disdain. "Well, if it isn't Ethan Daniels," Rick Barnes called out, stepping out from the shade of the coal yard office. The man's aviator sunglasses glinted as he adjusted them, his smirk unmistakable. "Didn't think Redville was worthy of your presence anymore." Ethan stopped and turned toward Rick, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Good afternoon, Officer Barnes," he replied evenly. But Rick wasn't here for pleasantries. He took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel, and crossed his arms. "What brings you back, Daniels? Got tired of playing big shot out there in the real world?" The workers nearby slowed their pace, their eyes flicking between the two men. Some leaned subtly on their shovels. Their interest piqued, but their expressions guarded. Ethan's gaze met Rick's, steady and unflinching. "Just visiting," he said simply. "Visiting," Rick repeated mockingly, dragging the word out. "That what you call it? Running back here to remind everyone of what you left behind? Or are you here to tell us how much better things are on the other side?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "I don't need to remind anyone of anything, Rick. Seems like you're doing enough of that for both of us." A few workers exchanged glances, some suppressing grins. Rick's jaw tightened. He hated being made to look foolish, especially in front of an audience. "You know," Rick said, lowering his voice but not his intensity, "it's funny how people like you think you can just come back here and act like nothing's changed. Like we don't remember how quick you were to turn your back on this town." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his tone calm, but carrying an edge. "And what exactly did I turn my back on, Rick? The judgment, the narrow-mindedness, or was it something else you're upset about?" The workers froze, the weight of Ethan's words hanging in the air. Rick's smirk faltered for a split second before he straightened his stance, his ego refusing to let him back down. "You've got a smart mouth, Daniels," Rick snapped. "Maybe you've forgotten what it's like to put in real work. Out there, you probably sit in offices, drink coffee, and let other people do the heavy lifting. But here, we do things differently. We get our hands dirty." Rick gestured toward the coal sacks stacked in the yard. "Maybe you need a reminder of where you came from." Ethan's eyes flicked toward the workers, then back to Rick. "I haven't forgotten anything, Rick," he said, his voice steady. "But I don't need to prove myself to you." Rick's smirk returned, more menacing this time. "Oh, I think you do," he said, his tone laced with challenge. Rick stepped closer, the gap between them shrinking. His voice grew louder, making sure everyone could hear. "You think you're too good for this town, too good for the people who stayed and worked while you ran off to chase your dreams? But guess what? You're still just Ethan Daniels to me, the guy who left." Ethan took a step forward, his posture unyielding. His voice was firm but controlled, like the calm before a storm. "And you're still the same man who thinks a badge makes him better than everyone else." The tension was palpable. The workers in the yard had stopped altogether now, their shovels and sacks forgotten. No one dared speak, but their eyes were locked on the confrontation. Rick's face darkened. He stepped back, adjusting his sunglasses as if to regain control of the situation. "You'd do well to remember who's in charge here, Daniels," he said, his voice lower but no less threatening. "This isn't your city. This is Redville. And out here, we don't play by your rules." Ethan didn't flinch. "Redville's rules haven't changed, have they?" he asked. "They're still built on keeping people in their place." Rick opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of gravel crunching interrupted him. One of the workers, a younger man with dark, sweat-soaked hair, shifted uncomfortably. His name was Tommy, and though he didn't speak, the look on his face said enough. He was torn between the authority of Rick and the quiet defiance of Ethan. Rick shot Tommy a glare, and the younger man quickly looked away, picking up his shovel. But the brief exchange wasn't lost on Ethan. "Looks like you've got your audience, Rick," Ethan said, his voice calm but cutting. "What exactly are you trying to prove here?" Rick's smirk returned, though it lacked its earlier confidence. "Just reminding you where you stand," he said, gesturing toward the workers. "And making sure everyone else remembers too." Ethan's gaze swept over the men in the yard, then back to Rick. His voice was low but carried the weight of certainty. "I don't need reminders, Rick, but maybe you do." The words landed like a blow, and for a moment, Rick was silent. The tension stretched, thick and unyielding, as the onlookers held their breath. Rick's lips curled into a sneer. "This isn't over," he muttered, turning sharply on his heel and stalking back toward the office. Ethan stood still, watching him go. The workers gradually returned to their tasks, though their movements were slower, their expressions pensive. One of the older men, wiping his brow, gave Ethan a small, almost imperceptible nod before resuming his work. The heavy, acrid smell of coal lingered in the air as Rick Barnes reappeared, striding out of the office with a self-assured swagger. Ethan was still standing near the edge of the yard, seemingly unbothered by the tension that had just filled the space. The workers had resumed their tasks, but their eyes darted toward the two men, curiosity outweighing caution. Rick grabbed a nearby sack of coal, his movements exaggerated as if to emphasize its weight. The burlap strained under the dark, jagged contents, and he hoisted it slightly off the ground before dropping it back down with a thud. Dust rose into the already sweltering air. "Since you're so fond of proving people wrong, Daniels," Rick began, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "why don't you show us you're still one of us? Here." He pushed the sack toward Ethan, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Let's see if you've still got it." The workers stilled again, their glances bouncing between Rick and Ethan. Some exchanged quiet whispers, while others simply stared, their faces unreadable. Ethan didn't move for a moment, his gaze fixed on Rick's as though weighing his next step. Without a word, he bent down, grabbed the coarse edges of the sack, and lifted it onto his shoulder in one fluid motion. The silence that followed was as heavy as the sack itself. Rick's grin faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning into his role as the instigator. "Look at that," Rick said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Guess you didn't forget everything. Bet you're feeling right at home now, huh?" Ethan ignored him, his movements deliberate and precise as he carried the sack toward the waiting truck. Each step was steady, unhurried, and without a single stumble. He reached the truck, placed the sack gently in the bed, and turned back toward the group, his expression calm but unyielding. Rick wasn't satisfied. He grabbed another sack, shoving it toward Ethan. "Come on, Daniels. Don't stop now. This isn't some city desk job. You don't get to quit after one try." Ethan stepped forward again, lifting the second sack with the same composed efficiency. His silence only seemed to fuel Rick's needling. "What's the matter? No clever comeback this time?" Rick taunted. "Or is this just too much for someone who's used to letting others do the hard work?" The workers shifted uneasily. One of them, a younger man named Tommy, hesitated before stepping forward. "That's enough, Rick," he said quietly, his voice barely above a murmur. Rick turned sharply, his gaze snapping to Tommy like a whip. "You got something to say, kid?" he demanded, his voice cutting. Tommy hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who gave him a brief, almost imperceptible shake of the head. Still, Tommy didn't retreat entirely. "He's not here to cause trouble," Tommy said, his tone firmer now. "Let him be." Rick's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "You want to lose your job, Tommy, because that's exactly what's going to happen if you don't get back to work." Tommy clenched his fists, his jaw tightening, but he stepped back, his frustration clear in the way his shoulders tensed. His glare lingered on Rick, though, the unspoken challenge simmering just below the surface. Ethan returned with the second sack, placing it alongside the first. As he turned, his eyes briefly met Tommy's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He then faced Rick, his posture still composed, his voice level. "Anything else, Officer Barnes?" The question, so simple yet so loaded, hung in the air. Rick opened his mouth to reply but found himself momentarily at a loss. The quiet confidence in Ethan's tone, the lack of anger or defensiveness, seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. "You think this proves something?" Rick finally said, though his words lacked the sharp edge they carried before. "All it shows is that you can still take orders like the rest of us." Ethan didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he stepped closer to Rick, his calm gaze locking onto the officers. "It shows that I don't need to prove anything to you," he said quietly, his voice steady. The workers exchanged glances, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. One of the older men cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Rick, clearly uncomfortable now, barked out a final command to the workers. "Back to work, all of you. Show's over." But the men didn't move immediately. Instead, they lingered, their eyes following Ethan as he adjusted his blazer and walked back toward the edge of the yard. His stride was steady, his head held high, and his silence spoke volumes. As he reached the road, he paused and glanced back at the group of workers. His gaze wasn't one of pity or superiority. It was one of respect, a silent acknowledgement of their effort and resilience. It was enough to make several of them stand a little taller. Rick, meanwhile, stormed off toward the office, muttering under his breath. His earlier bravado had been replaced by a simmering frustration, his authority suddenly feeling more fragile than he'd anticipated. Tommy watched Ethan disappear down the street, his expression conflicted. The younger man's defiance had been shut down quickly, but the exchange had left a mark on him, and on everyone else who had witnessed it. By the end of the day, whispers of the incident had spread beyond the coal yard. Someone had captured the confrontation on their phone, and by the time the sun set, the footage was circulating online, igniting debates that would divide Redville in the days to come. By the time the morning sun crept over Redville, the coal yard incident was the talk of the town. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation between Ethan and Rick on their phone, and the video was now making waves across social media. It was impossible to ignore. The image of Ethan, his blazer streaked with coal dust, calmly lifting sack after sack while Rick's taunts echoed in the background. The reactions were swift and divisive. At the local diner, where gossip flowed as freely as the coffee, the tension was palpable. Groups of townsfolk huddled around their phones, watching and re-watching the footage, their opinions splitting the room like a fault line. "This is ridiculous," one man grumbled, slamming his coffee cup down. George Harper, a lifelong resident of Redville, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Rick was just joking around. What's the big deal?" "Humiliating someone isn't a joke, George," countered Linda Collins, a middle-aged woman sitting across from him. She crossed her arms, her tone sharp. "He shoved those sacks at Ethan like he was trying to prove something." George scoffed. "Oh, come on. Daniels walked out on this town years ago. Maybe he needed a little reminder that he's not better than the rest of us." "Better?" Linda snapped, her voice rising. "You think standing there and letting someone mock you makes you better?" Ethan didn't say a word, George. He did the work and walked away with his dignity intact. "Can you say the same for Rick?" A few heads turned, murmurs rippling through the room. George shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but refused to back down. "Look," he said, gesturing toward his phone where the video was paused mid-confrontation. "This whole thing is just people blowing it out of proportion. Rick didn't mean anything by it." "Well, he sure looked like he meant it," said Tommy, the young coal yard worker who had stepped in during the incident. He stood near the counter, his voice quiet but resolute. "He wasn't joking, George. He was trying to put Ethan in his place." George narrowed his eyes at Tommy. "And you're just a kid. You don't know how things work around here. Rick's been keeping this town safe for years. Don't go acting like you're the authority now." Before Tommy could respond, the diner owner, Betty, stepped in, her tone curt. "That's enough. If you're going to argue, do it somewhere else. Some of us are trying to enjoy our breakfast without a shouting match." The tension simmered, but the conversation didn't end. Even as the diners returned to their meals, their discussions continued in hushed tones, each side digging in deeper. Meanwhile, Ethan had returned to the house where he grew up, a modest home on the outskirts of town. The memories it held were bittersweet. His late father's laughter echoing in the hallways, his mother's stern but loving guidance shaping him into the man he'd become. Sitting at the kitchen table, Ethan recounted the events of the day to his mother, Grace Daniels, who listened intently. Her eyes, sharp with wisdom and experience, rarely left his face. When he finished, Grace leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice firm but tinged with concern. "You didn't deserve that, Ethan. No one does." Ethan shrugged lightly, though his jaw tightened. "It's not about what I deserve, Mom. It's about what this town is." "This town hasn't changed much, has it?" Grace said, her tone carrying a note of bitterness. "They still hold on to their grudges like their lifelines." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. "It's not the same town I left," he said finally. "And maybe it never will be. But that doesn't mean I can't try to make a difference." Grace raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Ethan's gaze returned to her, his expression steady. "By showing them what respect looks like, by making them confront what they've become." Grace sighed, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You've always been stubborn. That's your father in you." Ethan allowed himself a small chuckle, but the weight of the conversation lingered. He reached across the table and placed a hand over hers. "I'm not going to let this go, Mom. Not this time." Grace squeezed his hand, her eyes softening. "Just don't lose yourself in the process, Ethan. This town doesn't deserve to take more from you than it already has." By evening, the video had spread beyond Redville, drawing attention from nearby towns and even local media outlets. Online, the hashtags Colgate and Respect Matters began trending, sparking debates that echoed the divisions in the diner. Comments flooded social media. "Rick Barnes is a disgrace. No one should be treated like that, especially in front of an audience." This is why small towns get a bad name. They can't let anyone succeed without dragging them back down. Ethan Daniels thinks he's too good for Redville? Rick was just reminding him of where he came from. The town buzzed with activity, the incident at the coal yard now a symbol for deeper issues. Pride, prejudice, and the struggle for respect in a place resistant to change. Ethan, however, remained quiet, observing the chaos from the sidelines. But inside, his resolve was building. The time for silence had passed. As the town divided further, Ethan made up his mind. He wouldn't just sit back and let Redville's old ways dictate the narrative. The next move was his, and this time, he'd make sure his voice was heard. The roar of an approaching engine disrupted the usual hum of the coal yard. Workers glanced up from their tasks, their faces etched with curiosity, as a sleek black car, polished to a mirror finish, pulled into the lot. Its tinted windows reflected the stark midday sun, creating an air of mystery that didn't belong in Redville's rough, gritty surroundings. As the car came to a halt, the door opened, and Ethan Daniels stepped out. He adjusted the cuff of his blazer, his movements deliberate and composed. The whispers began almost instantly, spreading like wildfire among the workers. What's he doing here in that thing? He doesn't look like someone who belongs here anymore. Who even drives a car like that in Redville? Ethan's calm gaze swept across the yard, landing briefly on each group of workers. His presence alone commanded attention, silencing the murmurs as he strode toward the center of the lot. Rick Barnes appeared from the office, his sunglasses perched low on his nose. His usual swagger faltered for a brief moment as he took in the sight before him. "Well, look at you," Rick said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Trading coal dust for a chauffeur, huh? Decided to make another grand entrance?" Ethan didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he turned his attention to the nearest group of workers, greeting them with a simple nod. "Afternoon," he said, his tone even. The men hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Their glances darted between Ethan and Rick, the tension thickening with each passing second. Rick, unwilling to let his authority slip, took a few steps forward, inserting himself into Ethan's line of sight. "What's the deal, Daniels? You come back to remind us how much better your life is now? Because we've all seen the video, and let me tell you, you didn't look so high and mighty hauling those sacks." A faint murmur rippled through the crowd, but Ethan's expression remained unchanged. He met Rick's stare head-on, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't come here to talk about the past, Rick. I came here to talk to the people who actually matter." The subtle jab hit its mark, and Rick's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, Ethan turned back to the workers. "I know what it's like to be in your shoes," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "And I know what it's like to be told you're less than you are, that what you do doesn't matter. But I'm here to tell you, it does. Every single one of you matters." The workers exchanged uncertain glances, their initial skepticism giving way to something closer to respect. Rick let out a dry laugh, cutting through the quiet. "That's a nice speech, Daniels. Real inspiring. But let's not forget who you're talking to. These people don't need you swooping in here, acting like some kind of savior. You're just trying to save face after what happened." Ethan turned back to Rick, his gaze steady and unflinching. "You think this is about saving face?" he asked. "It's about respect, something you clearly don't understand." Rick's face darkened, but before he could retaliate, one of the older workers stepped forward. His name was Jim Hayes, a man known for speaking his mind. "Respect's been in short supply around here," Jim said, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. "And he's not wrong, Rick. We've all seen how you treat people." The crowd stirred, some nodding in quiet agreement. Rick's glare shifted to Jim, his voice laced with anger. "Careful, Jim. Don't forget who signs your paycheck." Ethan raised a hand, his tone sharp. "Enough, Rick. Threatening people doesn't make you strong. It makes you weak." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Rick looked genuinely rattled. He glanced at the workers, their silence more damning than any words could be. Just then, another car pulled into the lot, a black SUV with government plates. A woman in a sharp suit stepped out, clipboard in hand, her presence exuding authority. The whispers among the workers started again, this time tinged with confusion. "What's going on? Who's that? Is this about him?" Rick's bravado crumbled as the woman approached Ethan, her demeanor professional but deferential. "Governor Daniels," she said, extending a hand. "We're ready for your briefing." The yard fell silent. All eyes turned to Ethan, who shook the woman's hand with the same calm confidence he'd carried since stepping out of the car. Rick froze, his sunglasses slipping slightly down his nose. "Governor?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan turned to face the stunned crowd. "Yes," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I'm the governor of this state, and I came here to make sure places like Redville aren't forgotten, that people like you get the respect and support you deserve." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Some of the workers looked at Ethan with newfound admiration, while others exchanged shocked glances. Rick, on the other hand, appeared visibly shaken, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. "Governor Daniels," Jim said after a long pause, his voice filled with disbelief. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Ethan offered a faint smile. "Because titles don't matter. Actions do." The workers nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over them. Rick, desperate to regain control, stepped forward. "Now hold on a second," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "That whole thing at the yard, that was just a joke. You know that, right? No harm meant." Ethan's gaze sharpened. "A joke?" he repeated, his tone cutting. "Tell me, Rick, did it look like anyone was laughing?" Rick faltered, his words catching in his throat. Ethan turned back to the workers. "You've been made to believe that you're less than what you are, that you don't deserve respect or dignity. But that ends now. You deserve better. From this town, from your leaders, and from yourselves." The workers responded with a smattering of nods and murmurs, their uncertainty giving way to a tentative sense of hope. As the crowd began to disperse, Ethan stepped aside to confer with his aide, already laying the groundwork for a community meeting. The time had come to confront Redville's past and its future head-on. The town hall was packed to the brim, with people crammed shoulder to shoulder, their faces reflecting curiosity, skepticism, and tension. Whispers buzzed through the crowd like restless bees, but they fell silent as Ethan Daniels stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. His presence commanded attention without effort, and when he looked out at the assembled crowd, his gaze was steady and deliberate. He stood behind the podium, pausing for a moment to let the silence settle fully. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of conviction. "Redville," he began, "is a town built on hard work and perseverance. It's a place that shaped me, taught me resilience, and gave me the tools I needed to succeed." The murmurs began to creep back in, but Ethan raised his hand slightly, cutting them off without raising his voice. "But Redville also taught me something else," he continued. "It taught me how deeply rooted fear and judgment can be, how quick we are to tear each other down instead of lifting each other up. Yesterday's events were a stark reminder of that." A wave of unease rippled through the room. Many people avoided his gaze, while others stared at him with open defiance. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his hands gripping the sides of the podium. What happened at the coal yard wasn't just a joke. It wasn't harmless fun. It was humiliation, plain and simple. And not just for me, but for every single person who's been made to feel small in this town. A sharp intake of breath was heard from one corner of the room. George Harper, a staunch defender of Redville's old ways, rose from his chair, his face flushed with indignation. "Now hold on just a second," George said, his voice booming. "You don't get to come back here after all these years and tell us what's wrong with this town. You left. You walked away from us. What gives you the right to stand up there and lecture us?" The room stirred, the tension thickening as all eyes turned to Ethan. But his composure didn't waver. "You're right, George," Ethan said, his tone firm yet measured. "I did leave, and that wasn't an easy decision. But do you know why I left? Because this town made it clear that if I didn't fit its narrow mold, I wasn't welcome." George scoffed, crossing his arms. "Oh, come on. Redville's not perfect, but it's honest. We've always been about keeping people grounded. Maybe you didn't like that, but that doesn't mean we need to change." Ethan stepped out from behind the podium, his movements deliberate as he addressed George directly. "Grounded?" he repeated. "Is that what you call it? Because what I've seen is a community that mistakes small-mindedness for tradition. A place where respect is earned only if you stay small enough to fit into someone else's idea of who you should be. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. George opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. His defiance faltered, and he sank back into his chair, his expression dark and conflicted. Ethan returned to the podium, his voice rising slightly as he addressed the room. Respect isn't something you can demand through intimidation or cruelty. It's not something you can hold hostage with threats. It's something we give to each other because we understand its value. And until Redville learns that, it will never truly grow. A few hesitant claps broke out, quickly growing into scattered applause. But not everyone was moved. Toward the back of the room, Rick Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by an unease that he couldn't quite mask. Rick stood abruptly, muttering something under his breath as he began to make his way toward the exit. But before he could slip away, Ethan's voice cut through the room. "Officer Barnes," Ethan said, his tone calm but commanding. "Leaving so soon?" All eyes turned to Rick, whose steps faltered. He froze, his back to the crowd, before slowly turning around. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "I don't see the point in staying," Rick said, his voice defensive. "You've clearly made up your mind about me." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't about you, Rick. It's about what you represent. The way you used your position to humiliate someone, not to protect or serve, but to assert your own sense of power." Rick's fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're better than me?" he shot back, his voice rising. "Because you've got a fancy title and a nice car. You don't know the first thing about what it takes to run this town." Ethan took a step closer, his tone unwavering. "What it takes to run a town is leadership, Rick. Leadership that builds, not breaks. That empowers, not belittles. What you did wasn't leadership. It was a failure of it." The crowd was utterly silent, the tension crackling like electricity. Rick's bravado crumbled further, and he stood there, visibly grappling with the weight of Ethan's words. Ethan turned back to the crowd, his voice steady and resolute. "This isn't just about one incident or one person. It's about how we treat each other every single day. We have the power to make this town better, not by clinging to outdated ways, but by choosing to respect and support one another." This time, the applause was stronger, more unified. People rose to their feet, clapping and nodding, their expressions a mixture of admiration and reflection. Rick, defeated, slumped back into his chair, avoiding the gazes of those around him. The meeting had changed something fundamental in Redville. As the applause died down and people began to leave, it was clear that Ethan's words had struck a chord. But whether that chord would lead to lasting change remained to be seen. The following morning, the tension in Redville hung thick as fog. Word spread quickly that Ethan Daniels had called a special gathering in the town square, this time to directly address the incident that had shaken the community. Townsfolk filed into the open space, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. At the center of the crowd stood Rick Barnes, his usual air of confidence replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. Ethan stepped forward, his posture firm, his gaze locked on Rick. "Officer Barnes," Ethan began, his voice carrying an unyielding tone. "It's time to address what happened." Rick stiffened, his jaw clenched. "I already told you. This has been blown way out of proportion. It was a joke, Daniels. People need to stop taking everything so seriously." Ethan's expression remained impassive as he gestured toward the crowd. "Was it a joke to them?" he asked, his voice calm but cutting. "Because what I see are people who've spent years enduring the kind of treatment you call a joke. You don't get to dismiss this, Rick. Not anymore." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a few voices rising in agreement. Rick shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the familiar faces around him. "Look," Rick said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've been a part of this town my whole life. I've done more for Redville than most people here. You really think one little misunderstanding erases all of that?" Ethan took a step closer, his voice steady but firm. "It's not about erasing your past, Rick. It's about taking responsibility for your actions. If you truly care about this town, you'll do the right thing. Apologize. Not just to me, but to everyone you've disrespected." Rick's lips pressed into a thin line, his discomfort evident. For a moment, it seemed like he might walk away, but the growing restlessness in the crowd kept him rooted in place. From the edge of the gathering, Tommy, the young coal worker who had tried to defend Ethan at the yard, raised his voice. "He's right, Rick," Tommy said, his tone steady despite the nervousness in his expression. "You've been throwing your weight around for years, and we've all seen it. This isn't just about Ethan. It's about all of us." The crowd stirred, emboldened by Tommy's words. A few more voices joined in. "Yeah, it's about time someone said it! We've put up with this long enough." Rick's head snapped toward Tommy, his face flushing with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid. You think running this town is easy. You wouldn't last a day in my position." Tommy stood his ground, his voice growing stronger. "Maybe not, but I know what it's like to be treated like I'm less than everyone else. And I know it's wrong. You've been using that badge as an excuse to push people around, and it's not right." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Rick's bluster began to falter. He glanced around, realizing that the support he'd always taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. Ethan seized the moment, his voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't about tearing you down, Rick. It's about building something better. But that can't happen unless you're willing to admit when you're wrong. Apologize. Show this town that respect is something you're willing to give, not just demand." Rick's shoulders slumped slightly, his defenses cracking under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the ground. Finally, he exhaled heavily and looked up, his voice low but audible. I was wrong," Rick admitted, the words sounding almost foreign coming from him. He turned toward the crowd, his hands clenched at his sides. "What I did at the coal yard, it wasn't right. It wasn't fair to Ethan or to any of you." The murmurs quieted, replaced by a tense silence. Rick's voice grew steadier as he continued, though his discomfort was still evident. "I've let this badge go to my head more times than I care to admit, and if I've disrespected anyone here, I'm sorry." The crowd remained silent for a beat before a smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, but gradually building. Tommy nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips, and Ethan's expression softened slightly. Ethan stepped forward, placing a hand on Rick's shoulder. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong," Ethan said, his voice carrying a note of respect. "But it's the first step toward change. Now it's up to you to follow through." Rick nodded, his jaw tight, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps relief, or the faintest spark of humility. The crowd began to disperse, the tension giving way to quiet conversations. For the first time in years, there was a sense that things in Redville might actually change. As Rick walked away, his head bowed but his step steady, he began to realize that earning back the respect he'd lost would require more than words. It would take action. And for Ethan, the moment marked a turning point, not just for Rick, but for the entire town. The days following the town hall meeting were anything but quiet. Redville, long accustomed to its stagnant routines, was now abuzz with debates and discussions. For once, the town's conversations weren't confined to whispers over diner counters or murmurs at church gatherings. They were loud, public, and unapologetically confrontational. In the heart of the main square, a small but determined group had gathered, holding handmade signs and chanting slogans. The signs read messages like, "Respect is earned, not demanded," and "Leadership without accountability is tyranny." It was a sight Redville had never seen. Residents openly challenging the authority they'd once passively endured. Among the protesters stood Linda Collins, a vocal advocate for change who had been galvanized by Ethan's speech. With a bullhorn in hand, she addressed the growing crowd. "This isn't just about Rick Barnes," Linda declared, her voice clear and forceful. "This is about every time we've let disrespect and intimidation rule this town. It's about standing up for what's right, for ourselves and for each other." Her words were met with cheers, and a few more people joined the protest, some hesitating at first, but gaining confidence as the group's energy grew. The protest wasn't massive, but its presence was undeniable. Not everyone, however, was on board with the shift in Redville's atmosphere. Inside the diner, a smaller group of older residents watched the scene through the window with varying degrees of disapproval. "This town's going soft," muttered George Harper, shaking his head. All this fuss over a little coal yard drama. Back in my day, you just dealt with it and moved on. Betty, the diner's owner, set down a pot of coffee with more force than necessary. Back in your day, people didn't have the guts to speak up, she shot back. Maybe that's the problem. The tension in the diner mirrored the broader conflict unfolding in the town. Redville was at a crossroads, its residents forced to choose between clinging to the past or embracing the possibility of change. Meanwhile, Ethan Daniels remained largely in the background, watching the ripple effects of his actions unfold. He had spent the past few days meeting with small groups of residents, listening to their concerns and encouraging them to take ownership of their community. One such meeting took place in the cramped living room of Jim Hayes, the coal yard worker who had spoken out during the town hall. A handful of other workers sat around the room, their expressions a mix of hope and apprehension. I never thought I'd see the day people in this town would stand up to someone like Rick, Jim admitted, leaning forward in his chair. But now that it's happening, I don't know. What if it just makes things worse? Ethan met Jim's gaze, his tone calm but resolute. Change isn't easy, Jim. It's messy, uncomfortable, and sometimes it feels like you're fighting uphill the whole way. But that's how progress happens, and you don't have to do it alone. One of the younger workers, Tommy, chimed in. It's not just about Rick anymore. People are starting to see that we deserve better, that we don't have to put up with being treated like we don't matter. Jim nodded slowly, his doubts beginning to waver. You think it'll stick, though? People have a way of slipping back into old habits. That depends on us, Ethan said firmly. We can't wait for someone else to fix things. If we want Redville to change, we have to be the ones to make it happen. The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of Ethan's words sank in. Then, one by one, the workers nodded in agreement, their determination growing. Outside the coal yard, tensions between the old guard and the voices of change continued to escalate. A small group of Rick's staunch supporters gathered near the yard's entrance, their expressions hard and defiant. This is getting out of hand, one of them, Joe Carter, muttered. All this talk about respect and dignity, it's just a bunch of noise. Rick's done more for this town than anyone else, and now they want to crucify him over one mistake? Another man, Frank Miller, crossed his arms. It's not just about Rick. They're acting like Redville's broken, like we're the problem. That's what really gets me. But as the group grumbled, they couldn't ignore the growing number of people rallying for change. The protests, the conversations, the quiet but unmistakable shift in attitudes. It all pointed to a town that was beginning to reckon with its past. The change wasn't confined to Redville's borders. The video of Ethan at the coal yard, combined with clips from the town hall meeting, had gained traction online, sparking a broader conversation about respect, leadership, and community. Local news stations picked up the story, framing Redville as a microcosm of a larger societal struggle. Panel discussions on morning shows debated the implications of Ethan's actions, with some praising him as a model of integrity and others dismissing the uproar as overblown. Ethan himself remained focused on Redville. He declined interview requests, choosing instead to let the town's residents take center stage. This isn't about me, he told Linda Collins during a meeting at the community center. It's about giving people the tools to stand up for themselves. Linda nodded, her determination evident. Well, you've done that, Ethan. Now it's up to us to keep it going. As the sun set over Redville one evening, the sounds of the day's activity began to fade, but the sense of change lingered in the air. The community was no longer content with the status quo. Conversations that had once been avoided were now being had openly, and the barriers that had kept people silent for so long were beginning to crack. The movement that had begun in Redville was no longer just about one town. It was becoming a catalyst for a larger discussion, one that would echo far beyond its borders. Redville was changing, and it was taking the world with it. The Redville Community Center was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. Ethan Daniels stood at the front of the room, his calm demeanor steadying the nervous energy that filled the space. This wasn't just another meeting to discuss past grievances. This was about the future. Ethan scanned the room, taking in the mix of familiar faces: coal workers, shopkeepers, teachers, and even a handful of skeptical onlookers who had resisted the changes stirring in their town. His voice, when he spoke, was firm yet inviting, drawing everyone into the moment. "Redville is at a turning point," Ethan began. "For too long we've been stuck in the past, clinging to what's comfortable while ignoring what's possible. That ends today." The crowd murmured, a mixture of agreement and curiosity. Ethan gestured to a whiteboard behind him, where a simple outline of his plan was written. "We're going to focus on 3 key areas," he continued. "Education, infrastructure, and economic opportunity. Each one is vital, not just for our town's survival, but for its growth." He pointed to the first item on the board, education. "Our schools are underfunded and overcrowded," Ethan said, his tone sharp with determination. "That changes now. We'll redirect a portion of the town's budget toward modernizing classrooms, hiring additional teachers, and providing students with the resources they need to succeed." A teacher in the audience, Ms. Carter, raised her hand. "Ethan," she said hesitantly, "we've heard promises like this before. How do we know this won't be more empty words?" Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "Because this isn't just a promise, it's a commitment. We're creating a transparent fund, managed by a committee of parents and educators to ensure every dollar goes where it's needed. And if we fall short, I'll personally secure additional funding through state grants." The room buzzed with renewed energy. Ms. Carter nodded slowly, her skepticism giving way to cautious hope. Ethan moved to the next item, infrastructure. "Our roads are crumbling, our public spaces are neglected, and basic utilities are unreliable," he said, his voice rising slightly. "We deserve better. Starting next month, we'll launch a town-wide revitalization project. Local contractors will have priority for bids, ensuring that the work benefits our community directly." A man in the back, Bill Hayes, crossed his arms. "Sounds good on paper," he said gruffly. "But where's the money coming from?" Ethan nodded, anticipating the question. "The state has discretionary funds for rural development that have gone untapped for years. We're going to use them, and I've already spoken with several private donors who are willing to invest in Redville's future, provided we match their contributions through community efforts." Bill frowned, but didn't argue further. The pragmatic approach seemed to quiet most of the doubts in the room. Finally, Ethan turned to the last point, economic opportunity. "For too long, Redville has relied on a single industry," Ethan said, glancing toward the coal workers in the audience. "But the world is changing and we need to adapt. That doesn't mean abandoning what we have. It means diversifying." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We'll establish vocational training programs to help workers transition into new fields, from renewable energy to skilled trades. We'll also create incentives for small businesses to set up shop in Redville, bringing jobs and revitalizing our local economy." This time, it was Tommy who spoke up, his voice clear and steady. "What about the people who don't want to change? The ones who think things are fine the way they are?" Ethan didn't flinch. "Change isn't easy, Tommy, and not everyone will embrace it right away. But this plan isn't about leaving anyone behind. It's about creating opportunities for everyone, no matter where they are or what they want for their future." The room fell quiet, the weight of Ethan's vision settling over the crowd. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with a few claps, hesitant but genuine, and soon grew into a resounding ovation. Word of Ethan's plan spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the media took notice. Local reporters flocked to Redville, eager to capture the story of a small town on the brink of transformation. Ethan's speech was broadcast statewide, his clear and passionate delivery resonating far beyond Redville's borders. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," he told reporters. "It's about creating something better. It's about giving people hope, not just here, but in every community that's been overlooked and underestimated." The story gained national traction, with headlines like "A Governor's Mission, Revitalizing Rural America," and "Redville Rises, One Town's Fight for Change," appearing in major outlets. Ethan, however, remained focused on the work. He met with state officials to finalize grant applications, held community workshops to gather input, and personally visited businesses to encourage investment. Not everyone was convinced. Pockets of resistance lingered, particularly among those who feared losing their grip on the town's old ways. George Harper, ever the skeptic, voiced his concerns during a televised town hall. "You make it sound so simple," George said, his tone sharp. "But change isn't just about throwing money at problems. It's about changing people's hearts and minds, and that doesn't happen overnight." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, George. Real change takes time. But it starts with a choice to believe in something better, to act, even when it's hard. That's what we're doing here, and I think this town is ready for it." The crowd erupted into applause, George's words drowned out by the growing tide of support. As Redville's transformation began to take shape, its story became a beacon of inspiration for other towns facing similar challenges. Ethan's vision was no longer just about Redville. It was about proving that even the smallest communities could create a ripple effect that reached far beyond their borders. Rick Barnes stood awkwardly at the back of the community center, arms crossed tightly over his chest. The room was packed with townspeople, all gathered for a planning session to discuss Ethan Daniels' proposed changes. Rick had attended similar meetings before, but this time, he wasn't there to exert authority or command attention. He was there to listen and to start making amends. The murmur of voices hushed as Ethan called the meeting to order, outlining the agenda with his usual clarity. Rick scanned the room, noting the skeptical glances aimed in his direction. He couldn't blame them. Months of unchecked arrogance had left deep scars on the community's trust. When the floor opened for volunteers to help with the town's first infrastructure project, repairing the main street, Rick surprised everyone by stepping forward. "I'll help," he said, his voice quieter than usual. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. Linda Collins, seated near the front, raised an eyebrow. "You're volunteering?" she asked, disbelief evident in her tone. Rick nodded. "Yeah, someone's got to set an example, right?" Ethan, standing by the podium, gave Rick a small nod of acknowledgement. "That's a good start," he said simply, then moved on to the next topic. The following weekend, Rick arrived at the worksite in jeans and a plain t-shirt, looking more like a laborer than the uniformed officer Redville was used to seeing. He grabbed a shovel and joined a group of volunteers, including Jim Hayes and Tommy. At first, the tension was palpable. The other workers kept their distance, their conversations stilted whenever Rick was near. But Rick didn't let the cold reception deter him. He worked steadily, hauling gravel and patching cracks in the pavement without complaint. Tommy, unable to contain his curiosity, finally broke the silence. "Didn't expect to see you out here," he said, his tone neutral but edged with suspicion. Rick wiped the sweat from his brow and shrugged. "Figured it's about time I stopped talking and started doing," he replied. Tommy nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in his expression. "Fair enough." As the day wore on, the tension eased slightly. By the time they broke for lunch, Rick found himself sitting with a small group of workers, sharing stories about Redville's history. It wasn't a complete thaw, but it was a step forward. Over the next few weeks, Rick's actions began to speak louder than his words ever had. He attended every planning meeting, often staying late to help set up or clean up afterward. He personally delivered supplies for the school renovation project, taking time to speak with teachers and parents about their concerns. At first, his efforts were met with skepticism. George Harper was particularly vocal. "What's his angle?" George muttered to Linda during one meeting. "You think he's doing all this just to make himself look good?" Linda, who had been watching Rick closely, shook her head. "Maybe he's just trying to be better, George. Isn't that what we wanted?" One evening, during a meeting about the vocational training program, Rick stood up to speak. The room grew quiet, the air thick with anticipation. "I've made a lot of mistakes," Rick began, his voice steady but tinged with humility. "I let my ego get in the way of doing what's right. I disrespected people who didn't deserve it, and I let this badge make me think I was better than anyone else." He paused, glancing at the audience. "But this town deserves better. You deserve better, and I'm here to do whatever it takes to make things right." The room remained silent for a moment before a smattering of applause broke out. Linda was the first to stand, followed by Jim, then Tommy. Soon, the entire room was clapping, not exuberantly, but with quiet acknowledgement of Rick's sincerity. Rick's redemption wasn't without its challenges. Old habits died hard, and there were moments when his temper flared or his pride got in the way. But each time, he caught himself, apologized, and worked to make amends. One such moment came when he clashed with Tommy over the timeline for the vocational training program. Rick, frustrated by delays, raised his voice in a way that reminded everyone of his old demeanor. Tommy didn't back down. "We're all trying, Rick, but you're not the only one here. Remember that." Rick took a deep breath, his jaw tightening before he nodded. "You're right," he admitted. "I'll step back and let you lead this one." The exchange marked a turning point. From then on, Rick became more collaborative, listening to others instead of trying to control every situation. By the time the first major project, a fully renovated Main Street, was completed, Rick had earned back some of the respect he'd lost. He stood among the crowd at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, clapping alongside the rest of the community as Ethan gave a short speech. Afterward, Ethan approached Rick, his expression neutral but his tone warm. "You've come a long way, Rick," he said. Rick looked down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Still a long way to go," he replied. Ethan nodded. "But you're on the right path. That's what matters." As Rick continued his journey of redemption, Redville began to feel like a different town, a place where respect and accountability were no longer just ideals, but values people actively lived by. The air in Redville felt different now. It wasn't just the freshly paved roads or the new windows glinting in the sunlight at the renovated school. It was the way people moved, spoke, and listened. The town that had once been weighed down by old grudges and stifling traditions now buzzed with a cautious optimism. Ethan Daniels stood on the steps of the town hall, looking out at the gathered crowd one last time. His work here was nearly done, and though he wasn't one for sentimentality, he couldn't ignore the transformation unfolding before him. "Redville isn't perfect," Ethan began, his voice calm yet resolute. "No town is. But what makes a place great isn't the absence of flaws. It's the willingness to face them head-on. You've proven that change is possible when people work together with respect and purpose." The crowd erupted into applause. Among them, Ethan spotted familiar faces. Linda Collins nodding in approval, Tommy standing tall with a proud grin, and even George Harper, clapping reluctantly, but clapping nonetheless. As the applause died down, Ethan stepped forward, addressing the crowd more personally. "I may be leaving, but this isn't about me. This is your town, your future, and what happens next is up to you." After the formalities, people lingered in the square, exchanging handshakes and conversations that felt less forced than they once had. At the edge of the crowd, Ethan saw Rick Barnes, standing alone, watching from a distance. Ethan approached him, his stride steady, his gaze unwavering. Rick straightened when he noticed Ethan coming, his expression a mixture of unease and anticipation. "You've come a long way, Rick," Ethan said, extending a hand. Rick hesitated for a brief moment before gripping Ethan's hand firmly. "I couldn't have done it without the wake-up call," Rick admitted, his voice low but genuine. "It wasn't just a wake-up call," Ethan replied. "It was a choice. You made it, and you stuck with it. That's what matters." The handshake lingered, and as they let go, the small act carried a weight that words couldn't capture. The moment was quiet, but powerful, a symbol of reconciliation and progress. The crowd noticed, and slowly, people began to clap. It started softly, then grew louder, the sound swelling with approval and hope. Rick glanced around, his face coloring slightly, but there was a hint of a smile as he nodded in acknowledgement. In the days that followed, Ethan packed up his things and prepared to leave Redville. Grace Daniels, his mother, stood by the door as he zipped his suitcase shut. "You did good here, Ethan," she said, her voice tinged with pride. Ethan smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It never is." Grace placed a hand on his arm. "You gave them a chance to see what they're capable of. That's more than most people ever get." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "Let's hope they make the most of it," he replied. As Ethan's car rolled down the main street for the last time, he noticed small but significant changes. A group of children played near the newly repaired park. Linda Collins was leading a group of volunteers toward the community center, where another project was already underway. Even George Harper was helping Tommy unload supplies from a truck, their movements suggesting a newfound camaraderie. Redville still had a long way to go, but the seeds of progress had taken root. Months later, a news segment aired featuring Redville as an example of successful community revitalization. The anchor described the town's transformation and highlighted its people's resilience and determination. In the footage, Rick Barnes was shown organizing a community cleanup, his demeanor a stark contrast to the authoritarian figure he once was. Linda Collins spoke passionately about the importance of unity, while Tommy explained the vocational training program's success in giving workers new opportunities. The closing shot was of the town square, where a new plaque had been installed. It read, "Redville, a community built on respect and dignity." As the camera panned over the plaque, Ethan's words echoed in the hearts of those who had heard him speak. Respect and dignity aren't just ideals. They're the foundation of every great community. Redville had proven that even the smallest places could spark the greatest changes. But the question remains, what would you do to make a difference in your own community? If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of transformation and triumph. Together, we can spark the change the world needs.
David Williams parked his old sedan in the lot of the prestigious Crest Hill Academy. The day had been long. Endless meetings, parent complaints, staff issues. But now it was time for the best part of his day, picking up Liam and Sophia. As he stepped out of the car, he noticed the glances. They were subtle, but he'd seen them before. Parents of the students at this elite private school weren't used to seeing men like him in their world. It didn't matter that David was the principal of this very school. When you were black in places like Crest Hill, you were always other. Today, though, those looks turned into something much worse. Two police officers, standing near the main gate, watched him closely. David had seen them before. Officer Grant and Officer Murphy, white men in their 40s, often stationed nearby. They seemed to enjoy the power that came with patrolling this wealthy neighborhood, where nothing ever happened, but where certain people were always out of place. As David walked toward the entrance, he heard a voice behind him. "Sir, can we talk to you for a second?" He turned, already feeling the tight knot of frustration forming in his chest. "Yes, officer?" David asked, keeping his voice steady. He knew where this was going. Grant looked him up and down, eyes narrowing as he sized David up. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to pick up my children," David replied calmly. Murphy stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Your children, huh? In this school?" David forced a polite smile, something he'd mastered over the years. "Yes, I'm the father of Liam and Sophia Williams. They're students here." Grant and Murphy exchanged a glance. "You got ID on you?" Grant asked, his tone hardening. David's eyes flicked over to the other parents, who were starting to notice the exchange. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. He could feel the heat of their stares pressing down on him. "Why do I need to show you my ID? I'm just here to pick up my kids." Murphy crossed his arms, stepping into David's personal space. "Because we don't know who you are, and you don't exactly look like you belong around here." There it was, the unspoken accusation laid bare. David took a breath, trying to keep the anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior from boiling over. "I'm not sure what you mean by that. I'm the principal of this school. I have every right to be here." Grant let out a short laugh, a mocking sound that sent a wave of humiliation through David. "The principal, huh? That's a good one. So, let's see some ID, principal." David hesitated for a moment. He could easily pull out his ID and end this, but the thought of being reduced to proving his existence in front of people who should already know him filled him with rage. He glanced at the gathering crowd, the way they were watching, whispering. The officers didn't care who he was. They just saw a black man in a place they thought he didn't belong. "Come on," Murphy added, his tone turning menacing. "Let's make this easy. Show us your ID, or we'll have to do this the hard way." David stood tall, his gaze steady. "The hard way?" Grant took a step forward, his voice lowering. "Don't play games with us. We can either do this quietly, or we can make a scene." David felt his heart race, but he didn't flinch. He knew they wanted him to react, to give them a reason to escalate. Instead, he reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his wallet. He opened it and handed over his driver's license. Grant snatched it from him, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny, as if it might be fake. "David Williams, He read aloud, shaking his head slightly, as if the name itself didn't fit the man standing in front of him. "And you're really the principal of this place?" David didn't respond. He just waited, his jaw clenched tight. Murphy, meanwhile, walked over to David's car, peering inside the windows. "Whose car is this?" he called out. "It's mine," David said, his voice strained with the effort of keeping calm. Murphy shook his head. "This beat-up thing? Doesn't exactly scream private school principal, does it?" David felt the familiar sting of humiliation burn deep. He glanced around again, noticing parents turning their backs, whispering among themselves, as if they didn't want to be associated with the scene unfolding in front of them. He saw the pity in some eyes, the judgment in others. "You know, we've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Grant said, tossing the ID back at David. "A guy matching your description?" David's temper flared. He took a step forward, locking eyes with Grant. "Suspicious activity? You mean a black man picking up his children from school?" Grant raised an eyebrow. "Now hold on. No need to get hostile. We're just doing our job." David clenched his fists, struggling to maintain his composure. "Your job, huh? Harassing a father who's just here for his kids?" Before the officers could respond, a voice pierced the tension. "Daddy!" David turned to see Liam and Sophia running toward him. He bent down, scooping them both up in his arms. They clung to him, oblivious to the scene that had just unfolded. The officers watched in awkward silence, their smug expressions fading. It was as if the presence of David's children made them realize, in that instant, how wrong they were. But David wasn't done. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said quietly, meeting their eyes one last time. "I'm the principal of this school, and I'm taking my kids home." Without waiting for a response, he took Liam's and Sophia's hands, walking past the stunned officers, the weight of humiliation hanging over him like a dark cloud. David walked his children to the car, the tension from the encounter with the officers still heavy in the air. He could feel his heart pounding, but he forced himself to remain calm. Liam and Sophia chattered away, completely unaware of the ugliness that had just unfolded. David envied their innocence, the way they could still see the world through unclouded eyes. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. As he helped them buckle into their seats, he felt a presence behind him. Turning around, he saw Sarah, his wife, standing a few feet away, her face a mix of concern and anger. "I saw everything," she said quietly, her voice tight with restrained emotion. David shut the car door, taking a deep breath before walking over to her. "Yeah? What did you see?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a simmering frustration beneath the surface. "I saw those officers treating you like you didn't belong here," Sarah replied, glancing over to where the two policemen were still lingering near the entrance, pretending not to watch. David nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. "Because in their eyes, I don't belong here. That's the problem." Sarah looked down, guilt washing over her features. "I should have stepped in. I should have said something." David let out a long sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "And what would you have said, Sarah? That your husband is actually the principal of the school? That he has a right to be here?" He shook his head. "They shouldn't need you to vouch for me." "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I could have done something. I just what?" David asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "You were afraid? Afraid that if you stepped in, you'd confirm every stereotype your parents have about us." Sarah flinched at his words, and for a moment, the only sound between them was the soft murmur of their children talking inside the car. David regretted how harsh he'd sounded, but the bitterness of the moment was too fresh to hold back. "I didn't want them to think that." Sarah's voice trailed off, and she looked away, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't want them to think you needed my help to be taken seriously." David's face softened, and he took a step closer to her, placing a hand on her arm. "I know you didn't, but the truth is it wouldn't have mattered. You stepping in wouldn't have changed what they already believed about me. About people like me." Sarah swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I hate this. I hate that this keeps happening to you." "To us?" David nodded, understanding her pain, even though it was different from his own. "So do I. But this is the reality we live in. And the hardest part? One day it's going to happen to Liam and Sophia. Those words hung in the air like a heavy weight between them. Sarah opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. She knew David was right. Despite all the love and protection they could offer, their children would face this same world, one that still saw color before character. They can't keep getting away with this, Sarah said, her voice trembling now, the anger and helplessness building inside her. You shouldn't have to go through this just to pick up our kids. David sighed again, glancing over at the crowd of parents who had witnessed everything but done nothing. No, I shouldn't. But it's not the first time, and it won't be the last. They didn't see me as a father or a principal, Sarah. They saw a black man, and that's all they needed. Sarah shook her head, her frustration palpable. So what do we do, David? How do we fight this? David was quiet for a moment, considering her question. It was a question he had asked himself countless times. How do you fight a system that sees you as less than? How do you fight a world that still refuses to accept you, no matter how much you achieve? We do what we've always done, he said finally. We keep pushing. We keep setting the example for our kids. We don't let them define us. Sarah nodded, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone, David. We're in this together. David managed a small smile, grateful for her support, even though the weight of the day still bore down on him. I know, he said softly, and I appreciate that. But this isn't something you can fix with just words. I need to stand up for myself, for our family, and for every person who's ever been treated this way. Sarah reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. We'll figure it out. Together. David nodded, grateful for the moment of solidarity, but he couldn't shake the deep ache of humiliation from earlier. It wasn't just the officers or the parents watching from the sidelines. It was the reminder that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he achieved, he would always have to prove himself in ways others never did. As they both stood there in silence, the sound of approaching footsteps caught their attention. Officer Grant was walking toward them, a forced smile on his face. Sir, ma'am, I just wanted to apologize for earlier, Grant said, his tone stiff and formal. We were just doing our job, but we realize now there was a misunderstanding. David turned to face him, the coldness in his expression unmistakable. A misunderstanding? He repeated, his voice low. Grant nodded awkwardly. Yeah, we didn't realize you were the principal of the school. Had we known, you would have treated me differently? David interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Grant hesitated, looking uncomfortable. Well, yes, probably. David stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with quiet anger. And that's the problem. You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with respect. Grant swallowed hard, clearly not expecting the confrontation. We're just trying to keep the community safe. David's gaze was unwavering. Then start by treating people in this community like they belong. Without waiting for a response, David turned back to Sarah and walked to the car, the sting of the day lingering in the air like a bitter aftertaste. The following morning, the incident weighed heavily on David's mind as he drove back to Crest Hill Academy. Today felt different. Normally, the school was his refuge, a place where his authority and expertise were respected, where he was David Williams, the principal, not just another face in the crowd. But after what had happened with the police, even this space felt tainted. When he arrived, the mood was already buzzing. Several parents stood in small clusters, their heads down, eyes glued to their phones. Whispers filled the air as he walked past them. David had learned to tune out the background noise long ago, but this time it was louder, more insistent. He walked toward his office, trying to maintain his usual composed demeanor, but the pit in his stomach deepened. As he reached the administrative wing, his secretary, Amanda, greeted him with an uneasy smile. Good morning, Mr. Williams. David nodded. Good morning, Amanda. He glanced at her quickly, noting the look of concern in her eyes. She was clearly holding something back. Is everything okay? She hesitated, then handed him her phone. I thought you should see this. David's heart sank as he looked at the screen. A video of the confrontation with the police was plastered across social media. The footage was shaky, but it captured every humiliating moment. The officers questioning him, the parents watching from a distance, his children running to him. It was all there for the world to see. The caption read, Black principal harassed by police outside elite private school. Thousands of comments and shares followed, with opinions ranging from outrage to dismissive claims that the police were just doing their jobs. David handed the phone back to Amanda, his hand trembling slightly. Where did this come from? Some parent must have filmed it. It's spreading fast, Amanda replied, her voice low. I didn't want to show you, but I thought you should know before the board sees it. David's breath caught in his throat. The school board. Of course, they would see this, if they hadn't already. He could already imagine their reaction. Not concerned for him or the racism he'd endured, but worry about the school's reputation. Before he could gather his thoughts, there was a knock at his office door. David looked up to see Dean Matthews, the head of the school board, standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was tension in his posture. David, can we talk? Matthews asked, his tone professional but clipped. David forced a nod. Of course. Come in. Matthews stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He sat down across from David, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. I assume you've seen the video. David leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. I've seen it. Matthews sighed, glancing down for a moment before meeting David's gaze again. This is unfortunate. We're getting calls from parents, and the board is concerned. They're worried about the image this portrays of the school. David's jaw tightened. The image this portrays of the school? He repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Matthews shifted uncomfortably. Look, I know what happened was wrong. No one is saying it wasn't. But this is getting a lot of attention, and some parents are upset. They don't want their kids exposed to, well, this kind of controversy. David felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. So, let me get this straight. Your concern is not that I was harassed by the police in front of my children and our students. Your concern is how it might look to wealthy parents. Matthews raised his hands defensively. David, you know how these things work. We live in a world where perception matters. The school has a reputation to uphold, and this kind of attention could hurt us. David stared at him, disbelief coursing through him. I was publicly humiliated because of the color of my skin, and you're worried about bad press? Matthews sighed again, clearly frustrated. It's not just about the press. It's about keeping the parents happy. We don't want to alienate them. David shook his head, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a heavy blanket. What do you want me to do, Dean? Pretend it didn't happen? Ignore it? Matthews hesitated for a moment, as if considering his words carefully. Look, maybe you can make a statement. Something that reassures the parents that the situation is under control. You could emphasize that the police were just doing their jobs. David cut him off, his voice low but filled with barely controlled rage. Their jobs? Their jobs involve harassing me because they didn't believe I belonged here. That's what their job was. Matthews fell silent, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of David's response. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, charged with everything that wasn't being said. Finally, David leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Matthews. I won't stand by and let this be swept under the rug, David said, his voice calm but firm. This wasn't just about me. It was about every person of color who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. I'm not going to make a statement that excuses what happened. Matthews looked uneasy, but he nodded slowly. I understand. I just hope you're prepared for the fallout. David straightened in his chair, feeling a new resolve take hold. I've been preparing for this my entire life. Matthews stood up, clearly uncomfortable with how the conversation had ended. We'll talk again soon. The board will want to hear from you. David nodded but didn't respond, his mind already racing with the implications of what was coming next. As Matthews left the office, David felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, frustration, but also a deep sense of purpose. This was his moment, and he knew he couldn't let it pass. When he finally looked back down at his desk, the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. The board might want to keep things quiet, but David knew he couldn't let this moment slip away. Something had to change, and he would be the one to change it. He turned to his computer, opening a blank document. His hands hovered over the keyboard, the words already forming in his mind. This wouldn't be a statement of reassurance. This would be a call to action. David stared at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. He had the power, the platform, and the voice to say something meaningful, to take control of the narrative. But as the words began to form in his mind, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. His responsibilities as a father, a husband, and the principal of an institution that now seemed more concerned with reputation than justice. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was Sarah. Sarah, have you seen the video? David hesitated for a moment before responding. Yes, I've seen it. It's everywhere. Sarah, what are you going to do? David stared at her message for a long time. What was he going to do? The board had made it clear they wanted this to blow over quickly, but he knew that staying silent would only perpetuate the same cycle of injustice. He needed to stand up, but the stakes had never been higher. I'm working on it, he finally replied. He put the phone down and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He could hear the murmur of voices outside his office, parents gathering for a PTA meeting that had been scheduled before the incident. Part of him wanted to go out there to address them head-on, but he knew that any confrontation today would be explosive. Before he could think further, there was a knock at the door. Amanda, his secretary, peeked her head in. Mr. Williams, the board is asking for you in the conference room. David's heart sank. Of course, they weren't going to wait for him to gather his thoughts. The board wanted answers now, answers they could control. He nodded. I'll be there in a minute. Amanda looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and concern. David, you don't have to go in there alone. A lot of us support you. We know what really happened. Her words were kind, but they didn't lessen the pressure David felt. Thanks, Amanda, he said quietly. But this is something I need to handle myself. She nodded, giving him a small smile before stepping out of the room. David stood up, adjusting his tie, and taking a deep breath before heading toward the conference room. Each step felt heavy, as if the weight of the entire school rested on his shoulders. And in a way, it did. When he entered the room, the atmosphere was tense. Dean Matthews sat at the head of the long conference table, flanked by several other members of the school board. Their faces were tight, their eyes sharp. The video had rattled them, not because they cared about the racism David had faced, but because they feared the repercussions. David took a seat at the far end of the table, meeting each of their gazes with a calm, controlled expression. He refused to let them see the frustration boiling inside him. David, Matthews began, his tone carefully neutral. We appreciate you coming to meet with us on such short notice. As you can imagine, there's been a lot of discussion since the video surfaced. David nodded, saying nothing. He knew where this was going. The situation has escalated quickly. Another board member chimed in. Parents are concerned about the attention this is bringing to the school. They're worried about how it will affect their children. And well, the school's reputation. David remained silent, his gaze steady. It was all about the school's reputation. Never mind that he had been humiliated, that his children had witnessed their father being degraded. They weren't concerned about him, just the optics. We've discussed it, Matthews continued, and we believe the best course of action is for you to release a statement. Something that clarifies the situation, expresses your appreciation for the work the police do in our community, and reassures the parents that the school is focused on maintaining a positive environment. David's stomach twisted at the suggestion. They wanted him to appease the police, to downplay the racism he'd experienced, all in the name of keeping the parents and their money happy. He took a deep breath before speaking. I can't do that. The room fell silent. Matthews blinked, clearly taken aback. Excuse me? I can't release a statement like that, David repeated, his voice firm. What happened to me yesterday wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was racism, plain and simple. I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make people more comfortable. A few of the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Matthews cleared his throat, clearly trying to keep control of the situation. David, we understand how difficult this must have been for you, but you have to see this from our perspective. This is about the school as a whole. We can't afford to alienate the community. David leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Matthews. And what about the black families in this community? What message does it send to them if I sweep this under the rug? What message does it send to the students of color who attend this school, who look up to me? Are we saying their experiences don't matter? As long as the white parents are happy. The room was silent again, the tension palpable. One of the board members, a woman in her early 50s named Patricia, spoke up. David, no one is saying your experience doesn't matter, but we're trying to protect the school. This kind of attention could have long-term effects. David shook his head, feeling the frustration rise. The only long-term effect I care about is teaching our students the truth. That racism exists, and it's something they're going to have to face. We can't hide from that reality. Not here, not anywhere. Patricia looked uncomfortable, but said nothing further. Matthews leaned back in his chair, sighing heavily. David, we respect your position, but we need to think strategically. If you're unwilling to cooperate, the board may need to reevaluate your role here. David's heart skipped a beat. There was the thinly veiled threat. He'd known this was coming, but hearing it aloud made it feel more real, more dangerous. They were willing to sacrifice him to protect the school's image. He straightened in his chair, feeling the weight of his decision bearing down on him. But he wasn't going to back down, not now. If that's the case, David said quietly, then I guess you'll have to make that decision. But I won't compromise my values, and I won't lie about what happened to me. Matthew's expression darkened, but before he could respond, the door opened suddenly. Sarah stepped into the room, her face set with determination. David's not going anywhere, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. And if this board can't support him, we'll make sure the entire community knows why. David stared at her, shocked but grateful for her unexpected arrival. Sarah stepped forward, standing by his side, her eyes blazing with defiance. The board members exchanged nervous glances, clearly rattled. Matthews shifted in his seat, trying to regain control. Mrs. Williams, I know exactly what this is, Sarah interrupted. And I won't let you force my husband to compromise his integrity to protect your reputation. David watched as Sarah took control of the room, her presence electrifying the air. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he realized in that moment just how much strength she carried within her. Together, they were stronger than any threat the board could throw at them. The board was silent, unsure of how to proceed. But David knew, in his heart, that this was just the beginning. This fight was far from over. The board members sat in stunned silence, their discomfort palpable as Sarah stood firmly beside David. For a moment, it felt as though time had frozen, the weight of the room pressing in on everyone. David looked over at Sarah, his heart swelling with pride. She wasn't just defending him. She was standing up for their family, for their principles, and for the future they wanted to build. Matthews cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Mrs. Williams, we understand your concerns, but... No, Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. You don't understand. You think this is just about David's job, about some PR nightmare you need to clean up. But this is bigger than that. What happened yesterday was about dignity, about justice. And if you can't see that, then you have no business running this school. David felt the room shift. The power dynamic was changing. Sarah had shattered the polite facade that the board clung to, forcing them to confront the reality they wanted to ignore. One of the board members, a man named Richard, shifted uncomfortably. Look, we're not trying to dismiss what happened. We just need to be careful about how we move forward. The school's reputation. The school's reputation is built on values of respect, inclusion, and education. David cut in, his voice steady but firm. If we let this incident go without addressing it openly, what does that teach our students? That we sweep things under the rug when they get uncomfortable? That we don't challenge injustice because it might upset a few people? Patricia, the woman who had spoken earlier, looked at David thoughtfully. So, what exactly do you propose? David took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. This was his moment to make a real difference, to shift the conversation from damage control to change. I propose we confront this head-on. We need to have an honest conversation with the school community about what happened. We need to talk about racism, about the biases that exist in our society, even in a place like Crest Hill. We can't pretend these issues don't exist just because it's uncomfortable. Patricia nodded slowly, clearly considering his words. Matthews, however, remained tense, his face a mask of frustration. David, I understand your passion, but the board has to think about the bigger picture here. Not all parents will be receptive to this kind of conversation. We risk losing donors. Enrollment might drop. David leaned forward, his eyes locked on Matthews. If we're afraid of losing donors because we're standing up for what's right, then those aren't the kind of people we want supporting this school. We have an opportunity here to show our students what leadership looks like. It's not about taking the easy path. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different. The board members exchanged glances, and David could see that some of them were swayed by his words. Even Matthews seemed to be reconsidering, though he was clearly reluctant to admit it. After a long pause, Patricia spoke again. I agree with David. We can't ignore this. We have to address it openly and honestly. Richard nodded in agreement, and slowly, other members of the board began to follow suit. Matthews looked around the room, realizing he was outnumbered. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. Fine, we'll address the issue publicly, but we need to be careful about how we frame it. David nodded, satisfied with the small victory. We can do it in a way that promotes understanding rather than division. I'll work with the faculty to develop a plan, something that includes the students, parents, and staff. We'll use this as an opportunity to educate, not just react. Sarah placed a hand on David's arm, her silent support strengthening his resolve. He could feel the tide turning, the momentum building towards something meaningful. The following week, David stood in front of the entire school community. Students, parents, teachers, and staff gathered in the auditorium for an assembly unlike any other. The video of his confrontation with the police had sparked outrage and support in equal measure, and the board had agreed to let him address the situation in his own way. David took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some skeptical. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. Good morning, he began, his voice steady. I want to start by acknowledging what many of you have seen or heard about the incident involving myself and the police last week. It was a difficult experience for me and my family, and I know it raised a lot of questions and concerns for many of you as well. The room was quiet, the tension thick, but David pressed on. What happened to me is not unique. It's part of a larger problem that exists in our society, a problem of racism, bias, and injustice. And while it's uncomfortable to talk about, it's something we have to talk about. He glanced at Sarah, who sat in the front row with Liam and Sophia. Their eyes locked on him with unwavering trust. We are a school that prides itself on teaching our students not just academic subjects, but values, respect, empathy, and fairness. But we cannot teach those values if we aren't willing to confront the challenges that come with them. What happened to me is a reminder that racism is not just something that happens somewhere else. It can happen here in our own community. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. I'm not telling you this to make anyone feel guilty or uncomfortable. I'm telling you this because we have an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to become better as a community. We owe it to our students to lead by example, to show them that when we see injustice, we stand up and do something about it. David could see parents nodding in agreement, students listening intently. The energy in the room was shifting from discomfort to understanding. We are starting an initiative here at Crest Hill Academy, David announced. One that will focus on education around issues of race, bias, and inclusion. We'll be hosting workshops, discussions, and events that involve not just the students, but parents and staff as well. This is about all of us. Together, we can make sure that Crest Hill isn't just a place of academic excellence, but a place where everyone is valued and respected. The applause started slowly, then grew louder, filling the auditorium. David felt a sense of relief, but also a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the future. His children's future, the students' future, and the kind of world they were going to inherit. As the assembly ended and people began to file out, Sarah walked up to him, a proud smile on her face. You did it, she said softly. David smiled, wrapping his arm around her. We did it? Looking down at Liam and Sophia, he felt a deep sense of peace. They had witnessed the best and worst of what the world could offer, but today they saw something else, hope. And that, David knew, was how real change began.